What is up, my fellow Anchor-ites? That is what I decided to call all of you. Welcome to my second official Anchor episode, my Anchor podcast. First and foremost, huge shout out to a couple different people. Shout out to people who watched or rather listened to my podcast yesterday. I really appreciate it. And second, shout out to the Anchor team. Anchor team sent me an email this morning saying they're considering essentially featuring my Anchor channel, which is very, very exciting. Obviously, it's not set in stone yet. It might never happen, but again, it would be very exciting if it does happen. So today, a really good episode for you guys. There's a website here that I got in front of me, which is markmanson.net/foreign-language. I'll say that again. Mark Manson, markmanson.net/foreign-language. And he's written an article here which basically says 22 tips for learning a foreign language. And just like in yesterday's episode, essentially what we're going to do is I'm going to read this, not read the article, but talk about a couple of the things that he said in the article and share my opinion on what Mark has said. And as per yesterday's episode, there's a lot of things he says that I agree with, and there's a lot of things that he says that I don't necessarily agree with. Now, the very first point on his website here says that conversation. And I'll read this to you because I think it's relatively well written here. He says, if there's a secret or a hack to learning a new language, it's this. Hours and hours of awkward and strenuous conversation with people better than you in that language. An hour of conversation with corrections and a dictionary for reference is as good as 5 hours in a classroom and 10 hours with a language course by yourself. Now, Mr. Mark, and I guess everyone else listening here, I agree with this general premise. I agree that having conversations and doing conversation practice and speaking with people better than you, I agree that it is incredibly important. No doubt about that. With the 5 languages that I speak, I've definitely noticed that. The more conversation I've done, the better I've gotten. However, the one thing I'm not sure if I 100% agree with is this. He says that an hour of conversation is as good as 5 hours in a classroom and 10 hours with a language course by yourself. I don't know if that is true, because in my experience, when I've studied different languages, I have found that conversation tends to be really good for practice, tends to be really good with speaking with someone and practicing and really fully putting into practice a lot of things that you've already learned. And yes, no question about it, when you're having conversation, you're learning lots of different words and terms and grammar points, etc. But in conversations, because they're relatively spontaneous, what will often happen is that the vocabulary and everything that you're coming across and everything that you're learning, it tends to come from a variety of different categories. You might learn, one word related to politics and 2 random food terms, and then you might learn like one thing that you find in a house, and then you might learn, etc. They're coming from so many different categories, which in my experience, and maybe not for everyone, but in my experience, sometimes that makes it hard to remember. Remember all the words that I learned. Versus if I take as Mark puts it, 5 hours in a classroom, that 5 hours, typically speaking in classroom study, you are very focused upon a single unit of study. AKA, you're learning about vocabulary related to your family. And then you get lots of practice exercises with that vocabulary, practice exercises with that grammar. And all of a sudden, it really ingrains it, in my experience, it ingrains it a little bit more into your brain. And for me, the conversation piece tends to be a way for me to practice things I've already learned. So, do I agree that conversation is extremely important? Absolutely. Do I think it is better than classroom study? I think in many cases, yes. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to spend all your time in the classroom. However, I don't know if that is always the case or not. Now, Mark on his website has written the following. Mark has written that classes suck and are an inefficient use of time and money. He's elaborated a little bit. I'm going to read some of this out. He said, all things considered, you get a really poor return for your time and effort in group classes. There are 2 problems. The first is that the class moves at the pace of its slowest student. The second is that language learning is a fairly personal process. Everyone naturally learns some words or topics easier than others. Therefore, a class is not going to be able to address each student's personal needs as well or in a timely fashion. And then he's gone on, he's explained a little bit about his own experience of learning, looks like Russian as I'm reading through this right now. But still, this is one point where I don't know if I fully agree with him. As a matter of fact, I would say I disagree with him. I think, and actually, let me reword that. I don't know if I disagree with him. I think it fundamentally depends on the individual. Some individuals will learn in a classroom environment extremely well. I've met many, many people like that. As a matter of fact, I am one of those people. I love taking language classes. I've done it for French, I've done it for Spanish, and I've done it for Mandarin. As a matter of fact, I've done it a little bit for Gujarati as well, but probably not enough Gujarati classes to really speak about that experience. But for French, for Spanish, for Chinese Mandarin, holy moly, they've been really phenomenal for me. One of the things that I really like about classes is that I just said it in the previous episode, I guess the first part of this actually, is that classes, they tend to deliver the content in a very organized way. And I understand, Mark here is saying that classes move at the pace of its slowest student. Yeah, tends to, not always, but yeah, that can happen. And you know what though, in my experience, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily bad. In my, that's my experience. So overall, Mark, on your point here that classes suck and are an inefficient use of time and money, I think you're taking a very black and white perspective on that. I don't think that is always true. I think it really fundamentally depends on the person. Well, let's leave that there. Mark here has then gone off with start with the 100 most common words. He's saying starting with the 100 most common words is a good idea. I agree with that. The one little thing I'll add to Mark's point on starting with the 100 most common words is I would learn words that are relevant to you. For instance, I'm a vegetarian, and in many cultures that's not overly common. And so one of the first things I tend to learn in languages is how do I tell people that I don't eat meat, because that is something that really matters to me, right? Or other things that, for example, I have a sister who is mentally disabled, and when people talk to me, that's something that often will come up. That'll often come up because I love my sister very much, and she's a very important part of my life. So talking about that is often one of the first things, maybe not the first thing, but often I do want to know how to talk about that when I'm learning a language. So, the 100 words, absolutely, I agree with that. That for sure. I just don't know if, on top of that, let's just say learning things that are relevant to you and your lifestyle also really matters. Mark goes on and says carrying a pocket dictionary. Yep, I think that's good. I think having a phone with a dictionary also really works. Let's scroll through his website here. I'm going to pick out a couple more. I haven't actually read the full article. I'm someone who flies by the seat of his pants in a lot of scenarios. So when I am making videos and making audios and such, I often will just improv. So I'm improving this. I like this one. He says, you're going to say a lot of stupid things, accept it. Yes, Mark, well done, buddy. I agree with that. The sooner you can get over, the fact that you're going to say a lot of dumb things, the better it is for you. I have lots of stories about that. Maybe I'll make a whole podcast about that one day, because I have lots and lots and lots of stories about that. Now, Mark has written the following. When you're learning a new language, you need to aim for the brain melt. What does that really mean? Well, let's read out his explanation of this. He says, you know how when you do a lot of intellectually intensive work for hours and hours on end, at some point your brain just feels like a lump of gravy? Shoot for that moment when learning languages. Until you've reached the brain gravy stage, you probably aren't maximizing your time or effort. In the beginning, you'll hit mid-melt within an hour or two. Later on, it may take an entire night of hanging out with locals before it happens. But when it happens, it is a very good thing. Now, Mark, there's portions of this that I agree with, and there's portions of this that I do not agree with. Here's what I agree with. Number one, I do agree that when this quote-unquote brain melt happens, I agree that it is a good thing. For sure. It's a sign that you're learning, right? It's a sign that you're pushing yourself. I agree with you there. I agree with you that if you haven't reached that brain gravy stage, quote-unquote, you probably aren't maximizing your time or effort. I think there's a lot of truth to that. However, I don't know if when you're learning a language of aiming for the brain melt stage is the absolute smartest thing you could do. Because the problem, in my experience, in my opinion, is that most people do not have a lot of experiences with languages. And what happens is that when they hit these brain melt stages, they often actually quit. They go, oh, this sucks, I'm quitting, and they stop. Right? And so I don't know if this is advice for everyone. I think that you can work your way up. We can work your way up to this. I think that pushing yourself and challenging yourself is really good. But aiming to burn your brain out or to make your brain into that gravy stage, I don't know, guys. I don't know about that. I'm not 100% sure if that is the best advice. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who just get super... I've probably seen the majority of people that I've ever seen learn a language. They don't make it past too many brain melt stages. They just don't. And so I don't know if that is the best advice, to be perfectly honest. The one thing I will say to kind of add on to this, maybe what is a better piece of advice, maybe, and I'll think on this actually after I record this podcast. What might be a better piece of advice is aim for occasional brain melts, right? So give yourself space between the brain melts. So give yourself a brain melt, right? Make your brain reach that gravy stage where you're completely pooped out, but make sure you don't do that exact same thing the very next day. It'd be kind of like if you went to the gym, right? And you completely burned yourself out at the gym, and you did that again the next day, 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 over and over and over and over and over. Guys, I don't know. That doesn't sound healthy to me. I don't know that much about how the body works in terms of the muscles and all that, but that just does not sound all that healthy. I feel like you would hurt yourself, and eventually you would just... I feel like you get sick or something would happen. Something bad would happen. And I feel like when you're brain melting, if you're brain melting over and 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 over in languages, holy moly, that doesn't sound healthy to me. So I think occasional brain melts, yes, probably a good thing. I think you need to be very careful with this piece of advice, though. The way that I'm interpreting the way he's written it, maybe I'm misinterpreting it. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, but the way I'm interpreting it is I don't know if it's written in the best possible way. So anyway, let's wrap this up here. Mark's got he's got a lot of stuff written here, but for the purpose of keeping this podcast short, I will wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please call in if you guys are watching this. Call in, let me know what you guys think. Hit me up on YouTube, on the Facebooks, on the Instagrams, on the Snapchat. I'm basically on every single social network. I'm everywhere. Search up PolyglotAzren, 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 AZREN, or Azren, the language nerd, and you will find me everywhere. So have an awesome day. I will see you guys later. Bye. I always wave at the freaking phone. I always wave when I'm wrapping this up. I'm more used to videos than podcasts, clearly.